Hey everybody, we today are going to be talking about trench warfare. Now, if you're looking at your notes and you're like, we got like one thing to talk about today, yes, that is true. However, and I'm really bummed, this is like my favorite day to teach all year with trench warfare, but not being in class and not being able to do all the stuff I normally do in class is kind of a bummer. So trench warfare is absolutely bonkers awful, all right? In World War I, this is the style of fighting that's going to take place. So imagine, all right, that you are 16, 17 years old, all right? A lot of you guys are pretty close to that, all right? So you're 16, 17 years old, and you've been drafted to fight in the Great War, as it was called at the time. World War I was not called World War I until World War II, because that would be weird to call it World War I before World War I, or before World War II, otherwise you'd predicting another war. Anywho, so it's called the Great War. Doesn't matter which side you were on, the type of fighting was exactly the same, and it was awful. So they now had a new weapon. So the rifles you would get is 1914. Basically 5 shots and then reload. You would use magazines. They were referred to as clips back then. So there's more modern weapons, more about what we have today. So you're from a country that's undefeated in war through imperialism, going to fight another country that's undefeated in war through imperialism, and you're marching across a field towards each other on the first day of this war. All right. Then a new sound comes out that's never been heard before in warfare. All right. So, sorry, jumping ahead here. This is the sound. No, those are not attack goats. That would be a machine gun. All right. Machine guns come out for the first time in World War I. Immediately, everybody lays down on the ground. If you don't lay down on the ground, you died in the first day of World War I. All right. The amount of casualties and deaths in this war are just staggering. Like an entire generation of men in Europe are going to get wiped out from this war. All right. So immediately, the machine gun takes, and both sides have these machine guns. Now, each individual person has like a rifle. But you can see it's a group effort for a machine gun. These things are very heavy. They're over 100 pounds. You don't carry them around. You mount them on the ground, and it is a spray and pray situation. Like it is to stop an army from advancing. All right. So everybody just lays down on the ground. It doesn't take long that they realize what you have to do is you have to dig trenches to avoid getting shot. So there's like these holes in the ground that are about 25 feet apart at some places. Let me get this right here. And so in order to be able to avoid these machine guns, what you had to do is you had to dig these trenches really close together. So this is what the trenches look like. It's literally like a hole in the ground that you had to stay in so you didn't get shot in the head by the machine gun. All right. So both sides had to deal with this. And so you're like, oh man, that's going to be awful. They're here for 4 years. 4 years. Imagine everything that has happened in your life since 6th grade. From 6th grade till now. All right. Now imagine none of that happened. Everything that you've experienced since you're in World War I that's happened in the last 4 years never happened. You've been in a trench for the entire. There's no weekends off. There's no holidays. There's nothing. For 4 years you have sat there. So your entire existence for these young men are standing here like this in the trenches. Trench warfare was absolutely as awful as you can imagine. But if it was just having to deal with the machine guns and then having to be in the trenches, it might not be that bad, all right? But it gets even worse, all right? Because the shelling, all right? So they would have long-range artillery way in the back, and they're going to launch artillery miles behind your trench, and you would think they're trying to launch it at the opposing trenches so that you can wipe them out. They're not super accurate. You're really close at certain places, and the area in between the two trenches is called no man's land because nobody should ever go there. So they're going to launch this artillery way over the heads of the bad guys of the other trench and blow up behind them. The reason they do this is because it's a psychological warfare. These explosions that take place 24 hours a day, and look at the amount of shells here. These are empty casings that have been shot. It's nonstop. They do that because you constantly live in a state of fear, and their side is shooting over on your side, hearing these explosions all around you. Since you live in terror all the time, you can't go to sleep. You literally can never go to sleep. Like after a day or two, you're like, oh, this is awful. After 3, 4, 5 days, you're not going to actually die from not going to sleep. But what will happen is your brain will start like just shutting off and shutting down eventually for like 15 minutes at a time. It's like a hard reboot of your system. And it is, so people are like hallucinating and just miserable. It's absolutely awful with the shelling and not being able to sleep for like 4 entire years while this thing is going on. It is miserable. But honestly, if it was just the machine guns and having to be in the trenches for 4 years, and the not being able to sleep at all, it might not be that bad. It might be, manageable. Oh, but it's trenches. When it rains, it fills up with water, and then the water leaves and it's left with mud. And this is what you stand in all the time. It's absolutely awful. Absolutely horrific. So you are constantly covered in mud nonstop. And then when it hardens after it dries, it's like locks into your legs, and it's awful. Now keep in mind, you're in these same places for like 4 years. So you use the bathroom, you eat, you do everything in that exact same 4-foot section that you've been assigned. It's absolutely miserable in the trenches. All right. Because the mud is everywhere. All right. So, and then like cases on your legs, it's awful. But I mean, if we're being honest, if it was just the machine guns, being in the trenches for 4 years, the shelling constantly, it's impossible to be able to sleep, and then the mud all the time, might not be that bad. But there is something horrific that happens to a lot of these men in the trenches. It's called trench foot. So I'm not actually going to show you a picture of what trench foot is, because you can look it up. It's pretty rough. It's where your foot rots and ends up falling off. It's where your foot falls off. It cuts off circulation because of all that mud, and your foot dies. A lot of people don't even know their foot has died because it's so cold there in Europe that they can't feel their feet. But so your foot can die. All right. And then the gangrene from your foot gets in your bloodstream and you can die from it. And you don't know until it happens if you have it, because you never leave. So you have no idea if you have trench foot or not. It is absolutely awful. It's absolutely horrific. So trench foot's where your foot falls off. But I mean, if we're being honest, if it was just the machine gun and the soldiers having to be in the trench for 4 years and never getting a day off and never to be able to lay down or anything like that, and then the constant shelling where it's impossible to sleep and you're like hallucinating and you're exhausting and everything, on top of the constant mud that you're constantly in, you can never get out of it. And then the fact that your foot can rot and just fall off, might not be that bad. Might not be that bad. Hey, you can handle it. All right. But every now and then, your commanding officer is going to have you charge, all right? That means he's going to blow his whistle when you have to come out of your trench, run across this area here called no man's land. You can see the other trench over here in the outside, and you have to sprint across. Sometimes this happens if their machine gun malfunctions and they're trying to get a new one out. You have to get up and sprint across no man's land, all right? And then they always get a second machine gun set up, and then they're that's a machine gun, not battle goats. All right. And they just absolutely annihilate the advancing army. You might be lucky enough and run back and jump back down in your trench and you made it. Didn't get shot. Well, your best friend, Billy, he might have some horrific injury that's like 10 feet in front of you, and you can't go help him out. Anyway, so, absolutely horrific, absolutely awful here having to charge. But if it was just the machine gun, the having to stay in the trench for 4 years and never being able to leave, the constant shelling where you can't sleep and you're hallucinating, having to stay in the mud all the time, having trench foot where your foot can fall off, having to charge across and maybe get shot yourself, come back, maybe watching your friends absolutely have a horrible death right there in front of you at eye level, then watching them decompose when it hits summertime because nobody's going out there to get them because you'll get shot. If that was all it was, it might not be that bad. Might not be that bad. But there's this stuff called poison mustard gas. All right. Both sides, I think Germany creates it. Both sides use it equally, so they're equally at fault for this. They launch this gas, and it falls down into the trenches. This picture painting here kind of looks like it's going up, but it falls down. That's what one of the things that makes it so effective. If you breathe this in, it like liquefies your insides, and you projectile vomit your intestines. All right. Now they gave you a gas mask, and 80% of them worked. You know how you found out if your gas mask worked or not? First time you used it. 80% chance you're going to be fine as long as you get it on before that gas hits you. 20% of the time, projectile vomit your intestines. Absolutely horrific chemical warfare that they used in World War I in the trenches on both sides just to maul the people as much as humanly possible. But if we're being honest, if it was just a machine gun, having to stay in the trench for 4 years and not going anywhere, the constant shelling where you can't sleep and you're going crazy, staying in the mud all the time where you constantly can't get away from it, trench foots where your foot can fall off and then you die because you get gangrene in your bloodstream, having to charge and then watching your best friends die out there and you can't do anything about it, and then the poison mustard gas, which liquefies your intestines and you can projectile vomit your insides. If that's all it was, it might not be that bad in trench warfare. However, if you asked anybody that made it through World War I in the trenches, if you asked anybody that made it through, hey, what's the worst part about trench warfare? They all tell you the same thing. The rats. They're everywhere. And these ain't squeaky, squeaky rats. These are squeaky, squeaky rats. They are extremely aggressive. The men are starving to death because these things will eat the food. They get so low on food, they're asked that they actually end up having to eat the rats and have to eat them raw because you can't cook them because you can't, if you cook outside, the enemy can see the fire coming from the trenches. Know there's a group of people, grenade there. If you do it at night, they can see the light, grenade there. So there were situations in World War I where the soldiers had to eat these rats raw. Rats. 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 All right. The rats were absolutely horrific in World War I. I mean, that was like a possum. Those things are enormous. All right. So the rats, and they spread diseases, all types of stuff. Tons of people in trench warfare were absolutely, completely, and utterly miserable. And it was like one of the worst experiences in warfare. And now warfare is always awful. But this is a new level of horrificness that takes place in World War I. So the question here is, what made the war in the trenches so bad? So here's what I want of all the stuff that we just talked about. I want you to write me 2 good, complete sentences on the things that you personally think are the worst parts about it. If you were forced to be in the trenches, what 2 things, and explain it to me in full sentences, what do you think is the absolute worst part of trench warfare? All right, that's as far as we're going to get today. See y'all tomorrow.